What's going on YouTube? Saharali here, and it is March 20th, so you know what that means. It's time for Animal Crossing New Horizons!
Animal Crossing and alcohol are all that I need. If you're done with that, then I'm down to meet ya. Animal Crossing and alcohol are all that I need. If you're done with that, then I'm down to meet ya.
That's right, it's the release date of the heavily anticipated Animal Crossing New Horizons, and I am absolutely stoked. So to celebrate our collective island getaways, I collaborated with a bunch of amazing artists on Instagram to create a huge cast of adorable Animal Crossing characters we might meet in our new homes. I'll have links to my fellow collaborators in the description box below if you want to check out any of the other amazing dolls from this collaboration. I was lucky enough to get the character Fauna, who is super cute and whom I love, so let's jump right into the custom. For this project, I'm going to be using a Shopkins Shoppy doll. I have two reasons for that. The proportions are pretty chibi, which I think will look similar to the proportions of the Animal Crossing villages, and my last attempt at customizing one of these went pretty terribly, so I kinda want to redeem myself. They aren't super articulated, but we can fix that later. First, I removed the paint with pure acetone, and I was honestly surprised at how resilient this particular paint job was. Look how cute her face is! Alright, so let's start with the clay pieces. For the ears, I'm going to roll out a thin sheet of polymer clay and cut a teardrop shape with a flat bottom. The flat bottom is important because when you fold that flat bottom in half, joining the two sides at the corners, you'll get a super simple and cute animal ear like this. For the tail, I roll out a thick little sausage, cutting the butt end to be flat. Making sure to reference my sketch for size, I cut off the excess and start forming a cone shape, which I then curl upwards to make a simple doe tail. For the buttons, I roll out a long snake and cut 3 evenly sized pieces of clay using a razor. Then rolling out one end of each gives me a little point for the buttons. Before baking, I push holes into one side of each of the buttons. They don't go all the way through, but they're basically a guide for me to use when creating the actual holes with my hand drill. They also doubled as wire holes, so I didn't have to struggle when I was painting them. I do apologize for not showing the painting process of these pieces, but they were just so tiny that I struggled to stay in frame and I struggled to stay in focus. I used acrylics and then followed that up with a few coats of matte varnish to seal in all my hard work. Next, onto the shoes. I have a mold for the Shopkins shoes, so I'm going to be using Barnes epoxy resin and pigments from Sophie and Toffee. Note that I have since learnt that alcohol inks like the one here are actually really not great for resin, so don't use them, learn from my mistakes. I mix up the resin as well as the pigment, and use the end of a cotton tip to push the resin into the hard to reach places of the mold, like around the toe. This is to avoid air bubbles. Then fill her up and wait for it to cure. I discovered that the shoe was actually slightly too small for this doll once her tights were painted on, since it kept scratching the paint off around the foot. So I decided to sand off the toe with my Dremel. Then I made everything smooth with some wet sanding and rebuilt the toe with more space using a polymer clay. Then, like a fool, I left the shoes in the oven for too long and they basically burnt and exploded, so not cute. I'm not going to show me recreating the shoes since the process was exactly the same. Again, learn from my mistakes. Speaking of, her tights were simple to paint. I primed the body using a plastic primer and then used 3 coats of this nice brown. After the acrylic paint came layers of matte varnish in an attempt to prevent chipping. Now as you can see, one of her arms has a little joint in the middle, giving her way more posability, but the other is lacking, so let's fix that. First thing we need to do is cut the arm in half at the elbow. Then we decide what size joint we're going to use and pop the pieces together. Link for these joints in the description. After finding a drill bit slightly smaller than the joint's pegs, we make holes in the arms and then push the pegs into place. I go with a slightly smaller drill bit that gives the piece better grip so the joint won't pop out as frequently. Now she can move her arm. Pretty simple. I love these hobby joints. Now let's get to sewing. Since the pieces were so small, I decided that rather than dealing with the bulk of the seam, I would paint the colour change in the sleeve by mixing fabric medium with acrylic paint. First I did the yellow at the bottom for the trim, and then I used the same brown that I used with her legs to paint the rest of the fabric. My silhouette cut out a scalloped edge on the trim, however the blade is a little dull, so I had to go in and manually cut the little points. Next I transfer my tiny pattern, cut it out with seam allowance, and then apply fray check to the edges, excluding the yellow trim. I transfer my pattern to this beige fabric, doing so on a fold to avoid a seam down the back of the dress, and then I cut it out and fray check again. I added some yellow ribbons to the ends of the sleeves because I felt like they looked a bit bare, and I used another strip of ribbon as a guide to make sure my spacing was consistent. I decided to hand sew this entire garment because I was not risking it being pulled down into the depths of my sewing machine. To sew all the pieces together, I join the shoulder seams right sides together. Then I insert the sleeves to the curve of the bodice right sides together. Then I attempt to sew the sleeves and the bodice shut right sides together, thinking I'll be able to push the sleeve through itself once it's all sewn down. That did not work. The ends of the sleeve were too bulky to push through, so I ended up undoing this stitch and stitching it closed from the outside using a hidden stitch. Now that it's all closed up, I fold over one side of the opening and use a blanket stitch to hold everything in place. Next, I cut off the seam allowance from the top and the bottom of the garment. I know this is drastic, but trust me. I measure the edge of the garment, excluding the opening with the blanket stitch. Initially, I had this measurement including the edge with the blanket stitch, but that ended up being too bulky along the front. That's part of the reason I always suggest you test your patterns when you're drafting them to iron out problems that might arise. I then cut out the fur fabric trim as long as the edge of the garment that I measured, and about 4 times as tall as I wanted it to be. Since I wanted it to be about half a centimeter, I used 2 centimeters. So fluffy! I attach it to the edge of the garment right sides together. Then I roll it down by 1/4 of its width, so 5 millimeters, oh my god. Then over again to create a rolled hem, and use a carefully hidden whip stitch to hold everything in place so that it looks neat on the inside as well as on the outside. I attach a hook and eye at the front to hold the dress closed. I create the little half circle things that go on the ends of the buttons by using these flat back pearls and cutting them in half, painting them brown, using the same brown that I've used for everything else. I made this tiny skirt while I was in the dentist's waiting room, so forgive me for not showing it. It's just a piece of gathered fabric attached to an elastic. I used embroidery thread to make the loops that will catch the buttons, and I used a pen to measure the loops so that they're consistent in size. For her hair, I initially thought of doing a reroute, and it started out pretty well. I was using the method that I've seen Delinks utilize, in which you cut up your yarn, push the needle through the hole, thread the yarn through the needle with a knot in one end, and then pull the yarn back out. This results in the knot catching against the inside of the head and means you don't need to deal with glue. It works well enough, except for the fact that the Shoppies head is so hard that I broke pretty much all of my needles doing basically 1/8 of the reroute. And it took so long. I honestly felt like I just wouldn't finish the doll if I continued with the method of rerouting, so instead I decided to just stick to what I know and made her a wig. First I made some wefts with the longest fibre I had to use for neatening up the part line later. After creating a wig cap and gluing a row of hair along the neckline, I drew a guide for where I wanted the part to be and began gluing the hair on one side of the line before bringing it over to the opposite side. The glue from the weft below should be hidden by the weft above it, and this crisscross method works really well for pigtails like what I'm doing here. With the part line done, I moved all of the glued hair out of the way and started filling in the empty space, just so her hair doesn't look thin and sad. For more specific instructions on the gluing method here, check out the video in the iCard section. Once both sides were done, I removed the wig from the head, cut an upside down capital T shape through which we will push the wefts to conceal the remaining glue. I start by gluing the fringe and allowing it to dry for a few hours before I start gluing either side of the pigtails, again waiting a few hours between sides since it minimises the risk of something going wrong. Once the wig was all dried, I had to glue the ears in place since they wouldn't fit neatly through a hole in the wig if I attached them directly to the head. So I just attached them to the wig's cap itself with some quick dry epoxy. After pulling the hair into a tail with elastic, I used some brown thread to tie it off and then used the same thread to hold little beads in place, giving us a cute wig that we'll finish styling once we're done with the face up. So speaking of the face up, my first attempt went bad in that the sealant didn't adhere properly due to the weather, so it peeled right off. Good start. So I cleaned it off and resealed during warmer weather and I didn't have any issues. First I started by putting down layers of blushing. This usually just goes on the lips, on the cheeks, the nose, the chin, the forehead, basically anywhere that the skin would reasonably have some colour variation. Then we start with the eyes. Since the villages in Animal Crossing have simple features, I kind of wanted to emulate that style and make this doll feel real cartoony and at home with the aesthetic of the game. So I start sketching out shapes with brown watercolour pencil, aiming for really cute, big, smiling doe eyes. Then of course I add brown to the iris and white to the sclera and pupil, and with that done I seal and move on to the next layer, adding more pinks and brown pastels around the eyes, as well as darker watercolour pencils in the eyes and nose, and another layer of colour to the lips. Fauna has a white pupil, so I decided to emulate this as well. I build a gradient in the eye with 2 shades of brown and add creases around the eye as well. Simple to keep it cute. The teeth would have been an absolute nightmare to do with pencil, so I decided to go in with watercolour paint. You'll notice I'm a little messy, but that's no big deal since you can wipe away the excess paint with a damp cotton tip or a paintbrush. I wanted her lips to be solid on the top and blended on the bottom, so I used a pencil to just simply draw the shape of the top lip. Fauna also has eyelashes, but since my doll will have regular eyelashes, I decided to convert her 2 eyelashes into say eyelashes more. I decided to convert them into a design element, adding them to the inner corner of her eyes, and then I add her regular eyelashes as normal. From there it's just building colour intensity and saturation, as well as adding a few little details like white for the freckles and highlights to her cheeks. Then I gloss her lips and nose and her face up is done. So back to the wig. I didn't want to trim the fringe until I knew where the eyes and eyebrows would be, so that's why I waited until now. I used a freezer bag to protect Fauna's new face from the water I used to style the wig, and just go in with scissors and a toothbrush, styling and cutting until everything stays in the shape I want it to. I also gave this wig a coat of hairspray because it was super prone to flyaways. I don't normally do this, but since this doll is a dedicated character, I decided to glue her wig in place with hot glue. Placing the fringe where I wanted it to be, I then hold everything down in place where I want it to sit and wait for the glue to dry. All that's left is to put her head back on, dress her up, and our little fawn is complete! I really love how this doll turned out. She's so small and cute and cuddly, and these photos really belie how tiny she is, which I think is cool. I sometimes forget just how small our dolls can be, since photos on a computer blow them up and they end up looking like 400 times bigger than their actual size. I just want to boop her tiny nose forever. Doing this collab definitely made me feel like Fauna is one of my favourite villagers now, and you can bet I'm going to have her live on my island when I start playing. If you're playing Animal Crossing, tell me your favourite villager in the comments below. I might even have my island code down there so you can visit me. Now that the video is all wrapped up, I'm gonna go sit at my door and wait for the postie to drop off my copy of the game. So that's all for this time. Give Fauna a like, subscribe, do all that YouTube stuff. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!